Sometimes it feels like getting your guests to share your episode is a full-time job. And if you are constantly cranking out brand new episodes every single week, this can be especially frustrating. You put your heart and soul into the conversation, you go to share it with the guest, and they maybe either don't feel comfortable about it or they decide to completely ghost you. That never feels good. But today we have Mai-kee Tsang. She is a podcaster and a strategist around getting on stages, getting in front of people, getting on podcasts. And she has such a wonderful way of talking about what she calls converse with consent. What I love about this is it's about creating a collaborative connection with your guest before, during, and after the conversation, as you're recording it, or before and after you're recording it, to ensure that the guest feels comfortable, they feel excited about what they talked about, and it allows you to feel like they are going to be excited to share the episode. I know that I had things in the episode that she shared that I am definitely going to be making some changes on. So I know you're going to be able to get some things out of this episode that you might want to be changing, whether that's before, during, or after your guest process. Please join me in welcoming Mai-kee to the podcast. Hello, Mai-kee. I'm so excited to chat with you today and hear all about your processes for really getting your guests to share your episode. I know this is a struggle that a lot of people struggle with. They just can't get their guests to share. So we're going to talk all the way through before the episode, recording the episode, and then afterwards. I'm excited. So if you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcasts.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be digging into this topic today. But for those of you who've yet to meet me, hi, my name is Mai-kee Tsang. I use she, her pronouns. And in a nutshell, I help human-first business owners get heard and hired by guesting on aligned podcasts, being sustainably visible, and cultivating a collaborative community. I am the host of quite a few podcasts, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to share two of them. So my first podcast is called the Quiet Rebels Podcast. I've been running this since 2019, and these are conversations with fellow business owners who are daring to do things differently. And I'm really diving into how they are changing the status quo and really supporting, especially folks with more marginalized identities as well. And so I'm really excited for those conversations. And then the other podcast I have, then like full transparency, this one is a paid podcast. This one is called Inside the Invite. And this is all about how to get invited as a guest expert on podcasts, summits, and for future seasons, I'm going to be focusing on how to get paid in private spaces, like, to run private workshops and stuff, and even getting paid to be on stages. So I'm working on season 2 as of this interview right now, and I'm really excited. So yeah, that is what I'm all about.
I love that. And I love that you have the two, right? So often I think we box ourselves in with what we can or can't do with our show. And sometimes it's just a matter of saying, I think I'm going to have a different one that is more focused on, a more niche topic that I can funnel people from the bigger one or the broader one into to really hone in, this is my expertise. This is what we talk about. And it's not like it's thousands of dollars for this private podcast.
Oh, no. No.
Very affordable.
Right now, it's $99. And for the information that you're getting that I have never really seen out there anywhere, it's a steal, in my opinion.
Yes. Especially because you've got enough episodes there. When it comes to podcasting in 2019, like I'm just thinking back to, because I started my first podcast in 2018. Don't go look for it. It's not there anymore. But if you were to go look for
it's archived.
Right. It's archived. It's gone. But there's so much has changed since podcasting around that time, especially that pre-COVID podcasting. How have you seen kind of a shift to how you've approached your podcast from then to now?
Oh, yes. Well, I started off following all of the rules when it came to uploading on a weekly frequency, because that's typically kind of the baseline. Like, you have to upload weekly in order to stay relevant, top of mind, and climb the charts. And just to say that climbing the podcast charts for me is a bonus. It's not actually my personal number one goal, but I fully respect the folks who are aiming for that. But because I know that my podcast is not my core lead generator, it's more of a trust deepener, like trust builder sort of thing, then I'm okay with not being the top of the top. And so I've really allowed myself to explore different frequencies of episodes. So I started off with weekly, then I did fortnightly, I tried monthly, I considered seasons, but I just find myself going like on and off hiatus depending on things. And then I just created a brand new frequency that I've never seen anyone kind of own. But whenever I talk about it, people are leaning in like, tell me more, because I call it the intuitive release schedule. And basically I release episodes whenever I want. And the reason for that, when I communicated this to my community, my peers, I just said, I really want to release my episodes when they're at their highest energetic potency and when I can really show up for the conversations that I'm ready to have and to really support my guests. Because I think when I was at the weekly point, I started feeling a little bit of resentment to myself. And I felt really guilty about not really honoring the episodes with my guests. Like they had incredible things to say. We had great conversations. That was not the problem. The problem was me kind of like going at a pace that was clearly not my own. So yeah, I kind of like went into the intuitive release schedule. People have been loving it. So yeah, I'm great.
That is really interesting. And I'm curious if you know your human design, because we just had someone on recently talking about human design and how it can impact how we show up with our content. Do you mind sharing?
Absolutely. So I am a 4/6 ego manifestor, and manifestors in general, we do not have, I think it's at our sacral center. It's not open, meaning that I don't have consistent access to my energy. It really ebbs and flows. That's why I personally need to run a business that is not fully reliant on me having to be there and show up all the time. So earlier when I mentioned that I talk about sustainable visibility, that's very much about showing up in a way that supports your needs, your values, and just really how you want to show up in the world. And I know with my personal community, I do tend to reach more marginalized communities, and they tell me how refreshing it is that I show up very intentionally, even if it's not all the time. And so that tells me I've cultivated that kind of community that is not based on how often I'm showing up, but how I show up every time I do. And so that's just something that we seem to have in common. So that's why things like the intuitive release schedule, they really seem to hit home because they don't need to be on all the time to listen or read all the content I'm churning out, because I'm very like, I'm cherry picking the best times to release it.
Yeah. So everybody go back and listen to that episode with Karen Page, because everything you're saying is exactly what she was saying about manifestors.
Oh, yes, Karen. Yes.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. I love being able to like tie in, you know, the different parts of the elements of the episodes.
Love it.
I recently saw a post on Threads. Now, I have a love-hate with Threads because it reminds me too much of Twitter, which I hate. And so what is now considered X. But I saw someone post, because I get a lot of things and I'm looking over at my phone for those who are watching the video. I want to make sure that I quote this correctly, because when I saw this, I kind of was a little flabbergasted. So this person has been podcasting for a while, and they wrote, "Controversial podcast take. I'm adding language to my guest booking agreement that says if they're unable to promote their appearance as they committed to at intake, the episode will be deleted after 30 days. I'm done sharing my platform with people who don't do as they say that they'll do. Podcast hosts, I love your take." Now, a lot of the comments were explaining to her the give and take, right, of a guest host relationship, that they are helping you facilitate content for your audience, that it is up to the host to also promote the show, that it shouldn't always be just on the guest, and that the majority of guests do not share episodes. And it was a really, like, I mean, I disagree with having that language in there. It's very aggressive to me. And I tend to be an aggressive type of person anyway. But this was a little too far for, you know, the hard stops, right? I don't like
the baseline.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Those kind of like hard and fast rules, I don't like them. And so that would not be a podcast that I would want to be on, just because I know everybody's schedule is different. And so I think having those conversations up front is really important. And so let's get into kind of how you make sure and ensure that you have a guest that is actually going to share the episode. You call this Converse with Consent. And I obviously consent's really important. So I just love that title. But let's go ahead and dive right in.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, that language there, like the thing is though, I get it. I do understand that frustration. Don't get me wrong. Like, I've been a host for 5 years out of this year. And so I do understand. And I always teach my students, because I teach them how to guest on podcasts, like how to pitch themselves, right? And I always say, don't ghost a host. don't do that. Like, because you are basically just burning the bridge before it has a chance to be properly built. So don't do that. Right. So just zooming out there. And also when it comes to conversing with consent, yes, don't get me wrong. It is about kind of creating those conversations that guests are proud to share. But also the bigger picture of conversing with consent is sometimes guests, they aren't aware of where their personal uncharted territories are until they've gotten there and like look back in retrospect. So I truly believe that it is our job as the host to be able to hold a space for them to navigate their narrative as safely as possible that they're open to sharing. So that's the bigger picture of conversing with consent. But of course, the result from it is hopefully to have guests who are really proud to share their episodes with us. So yeah, let's just wanted to kind of frame it there first.
I recently did an episode on Successful Podcasting Unlocked where I talked about, because it was just me, the collective we of Alicia talked about if your guest asks you to take your episode down. That is a real thing. That has happened to some of our clients. And I think that it's really important that you do what Mai-kee's saying and what we're about to discuss ahead of time to negate that from happening. Right? Because one of the number one reasons why people tend to say, hey, I want that taken down is they said something they're not proud of or that reflected poorly on them. And that's not something that we would want in our show and they wouldn't want out. And so they're not going to share that. So keep that in mind that this is not just it's creating a good relationship. It's saving you headache and stress down the road as well.
Yes. And I've personally never had a guest ask me to take something down. And I like to think that's because I've hopefully made them comfortable with the kind of conversations that we have, but still being able to go deep, right? So it's a beautiful balance, it's a dance that you get to have with your guest. So I'm going to walk you through the 3 stages of conversing with consent. So it's the before, during, and after. So it's going to be super easy to remember. And the key here is to really set expectations and to provide multiple check-in points, just to make sure that you're still continually on the same page because, like you said, life happens, things change. And because I've heard from a lot of my peers who've been on big podcasts and they tell me, Mai-kee, I wish I didn't guest on there, or like I'm really ashamed to share this. And I'm like, oh, okay. And when I've had conversations with them, it's because they didn't have these expectations set. I had a friend of mine who, you know how sometimes we have a great conversation in the green room and then we hit record, but then the green room chat was released without her consent and it was a part of the overall episode. And these are like big no-nos because we do not have the consent for that. Yeah, like, no, don't do that.
Oh my goodness.
All right, so let's start off with stage 1, which is the before. This is all about setting all these expectations. And I would say most of the heavy lifting is here. The rest is kind of like easy breezy, walk in the park. Okay. So the before stage is before you actually record. So think about, it's kind of like the intention for this guest to be on your show. What is that intention? Make sure that's aligned first and foremost. So be upfront and clear the kind of questions that you're going to be asking them, and offer a space in your onboarding form, like, because it's likely that if you have guests on your show, you need them to fill in some kind of form, like their bio, their links, all of that. And have a question in there that allows them to share the kind of areas they don't want to talk about. And if they're not used to answering that question, give them examples, right? So I say things like, if there are some tender topics such as X, Y, Z, or any trigger points or any kind of like sensitive spots in your stories, like, and I'll give some examples that aren't too big, but just to kind of like get their creative juices flowing, like, oh, I've never thought of it that way. And I share the reason why I'm asking this question. I'd always say, I'm asking you this because the last thing I want to do is make you feel unsafe or uncomfortable at any point in this conversation. So if I can help support you in this, please let me know, right? So at least then they're like, okay, this is the reason why this question is being asked of me. And I promise you, people are really going to fill out that section, like if they need it, right? And you're also going to be remembered, because I have had a couple of guests on my show who are very hard to book as guests because of how selective they are. And the number one reason why they feel safe enough with me is because of this question.
Yeah, that's so good too. And I'm thinking even if you just have a basic business podcast, right? Like maybe you talk about marketing, maybe you talk about email marketing. Let's get specific here. You can still have that section and it can still set them up for feeling comfortable. And I remember I was on this one podcast one time and I share my story pretty openly. I'm quite open about growing up in a cult, having a single mother, her passing away, drug use, all of that stuff. Like I'm an open book, but there are certain things that I will not get very specific on, like naming people, naming places, naming things like that would put someone else in a bad light. And so I've had conversations where I've shared like my journey in a cult when I was growing up, and the person kind of like was like, "So can you tell us the name of the cult?" And I'm like, "Nope, that's not something that I feel comfortable doing. We just call it the camp. That's it." And, they're like, "Oh, so you really won't?" And like they kind of poked and prodded, and that didn't make me feel good. Right. Like,
no,
like at that point,
not.
I'm like, okay, pause.
Yeah.
And it was live, which that wasn't helpful either.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
So this is an important question, and I'm going to go and change my intake form to have this question because like, and people can say nothing. I'm good. I'm an open book. We could talk about whatever. But I think about even like books that I read. Obviously, I'm an avid reader. You guys know this. We talk about this constantly. And the page that has the trigger warnings at the front of the book is there not to give spoilers or to give away things that are going to happen, but to help people either prepare themselves for what could happen in the book that might be triggering for them, or say, you know what, this book is not for me because it has this. And that's okay, right? Everybody who you might want to be on your show doesn't have to be on your show. There are going to be other people. I think the ratio is one host to like 25 people that are trying to get on shows. So there's plenty of fish in the sea, guys. So I love that question. That's so good. Anything else that we need to be doing in that before stage, or should we move on to that during?
Oh, actually, this is a brand new one that I came up with as I was preparing for this interview. I'm like, wait, I need to add this into my own intake form. So less than adding to my Asana checklist for later. But because the whole purpose of converting with consent is to have consensual conversations that our guests are proud to share and that we are proud to share. So why don't we reverse engineer that by asking them the question, what can I do to make this an episode that you are proud to share? Right? So what needs to happen, or what question do I need to ask you? Whatever that is, some variation of the question where we get to future pace together to co-create a conversation we are both proud to share. So when they write something in there, then we are basically given specific instructions from that guest what to do. And of course, it's a beautiful balance because it's still your show, right? But you can still meet them halfway.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. And that really is what having these podcast conversations is, right? It's two people having a private conversation that then gets shared, right? And so act like it. This is just two human beings talking, and the same respect that you would want as a guest, you should give to your guest. So it feels kind of no-brainer, but it doesn't always, especially when...
We'd be surprised. It's not common practice, I'll tell you that.
Right? Especially when it comes to when we find ourselves in a cadence or a frequency that feels hard, right? So if we are someone who is constantly pumping out guest episodes, and maybe we're constantly late on those guest episodes, or we're batching them like crazy, and we get to the point where we are just done, like you're not doing your guest a service that way. It's making it not great for you and not great for them. So I think that this is so important for people.
Yeah. And I hope that these questions will be added to as many future intake forms as possible for all the lovely listeners who are podcasters here.
Yes. All right, let's move on to that during.
Yes, during. So like I said, the before is the biggest heavy lift. These are just like skipping pebbles in a pond now. So during, what happens on interview day? So remember, at this point, you have been given insight into how to best support your guest through whichever conversation you're about to have based on the topic you both agreed on. So during is basically when you're in the green room, i.e. before you hit record. Again, just kind of reiterate how the conversation's going to go, just like how you did before we hit record here. And then let them know like any questions that they might need a heads up on. So for example, something that I like to remind people of is that there's a bonus question I ask at the end of every interview I do. And it's, what's one weird fact or a fun story about you no one else knows on the internet, right? Because I don't want to kind of catch them off guard at the end, because that's what can often make people feel uncomfortable or even anxious as a result of that, because it's kind of a curveball question. And so before you hit record, just set the expectation how it's going to go and open up the space. Do not rush this particular part. Open up the space and say, is there anything I can do to make this a really wonderful conversation? Or again, just kind of like looping back to what they said in the forums, like, again, what is there anything I can do to make this a really share-worthy episode? And is there any questions you have for me? And really take your time here, like pause. Do not rush into it, because we know the people who are kind of listening to respond versus listening to hold space.
Yeah, that's
so all
true.
You really need to do during the during.
Yes. Yeah, that green room conversation is so important. I mean, I was recently on a show. It was great. Like, it ended up being great, but I hopped onto Zoom and we were already recording and I was like, okay.
Yeah, really, that always throws me off. That throws me off all the time. And I'm like, is this going to be used, by the way? I didn't consent for this. It throws me off every time.
Let's jump in then. Cool. Like, I just sat down. All right.
It's like deer in the headlights moment. Oh, God.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that green room space is so important, and it allows you to create that connection with the person, especially if you don't know them, right? Obviously, you've done your research, you've gotten to know them a little bit, but it can also let you know, is this a conversation that we are going to feel good about, right? Or is this maybe if their business has shifted because they pitched months ago, is this is the direction I'd like to take the conversation? Does this still feel aligned for you? And like letting them know when the episode is going to go live too, I think is really helpful, because then it sets the conversation up for, oh, I have this thing happening around that time frame. This is where to direct people, or I'll have the new podcast launched by then. So perfect. Let's direct people to that podcast. So I think it's really important that we're giving the guest as much information as possible to allow them to feel comfortable and confident in how they're able to show up.
Absolutely. Which brings me to the final stage of the after. So this is at the point when the interview is done and you haven't quite finished, like you haven't ended the call yet. And just, again, it's setting those expectations. What I personally do, I always ask my guests, how did you find it? And I was like, it's okay if it wasn't okay. It's kind of like, if it actually wasn't, then please tell me, because sometimes I do offer the opportunity to re-record. I mean, like recently I asked a guest to re-record because I really felt like we didn't do each other justice, you know? And it's because I have such a connection with each of my guests. That's why I'm so selective of them, that we can have conversations like that are very transparent, right? So really asking them, how was it? And is this an interview that you would be proud to share? And like asking that without the expectation that they're going to be 100% positive, because we don't know. Hopefully, if we've done all of the steps in the before and during, they should feel great at this point, but we don't know. And so when like I just want to give you like props to you, Alicia, that you said, hey, by the way, we have an editor. So if something goes off and you want something cut out, let me know and we'll make that happen. Right. So that tells me, oh, okay. So this isn't set in stone. So just letting them know like, hey, I care how this conversation went for you. And is this something that you're still proud to share? Is there anything you want me to cut out or like not release when you look back in retrospect? It's just giving them an option to opt out.
It's consent all the way through, right? Because then you do give them that ability. You give them that ability at the end to say, you know what, that really, you know, maybe my mind was elsewhere. I really feel like I didn't show up 100%. I didn't really feel prepared for some of those questions. Like, you can have that conversation. And that's so funny because that's literally what I asked my guests afterwards. I'm like, how do you feel? And that leads them to, all right, how do you feel about the conversation? Does it feel good? All right, cool. Just a reminder, this is when your episode's going to go live. This is all the information we're going to send you. And this is when you can expect that. And so it kind of wraps it up really nicely so that they are excited, right, to share the episode. And I love, we've had clients where their guest has either it's been a poor interview or the guest has like they weren't really able to pull everything that they wanted to from the guest for whatever reason. And so we'll say Mercury was in retrograde and something happened to the audio. Let's go ahead and record again, right? Like there's ways that you could get around it to be like, I didn't really feel comfortable or confident as a host about that. I feel like we could go deeper, or I feel like we could get more value for the audience that way. And though that second conversation is always better than the first one every time. And that one's the one that they're excited to share about. That's the one they're excited to, promote on their end. And then the host is also really excited to share it because they feel like they really got the most out of that conversation. So there's so many ways that we can do this, but I do love that you really did create that consent all the way through. If you guys are like, well, what do I need to send the guest afterwards? We have episodes on that. We'll make sure we link that in the show notes because that is just as important that you as a host are providing the guest with everything that they would need to be able to share the episode as well. So yes, you've set them up with everything Mai-kee has said and you both feel good. But 2 months from now when the episode's live, what in the world did you talk about? Have that in the email. Like there's tons of things that you need to have in there to make sure that they're sharing it, after the fact, especially if it's months later. So this has been so good. Is there anything else that you feel like, please don't forget this, or we totally missed on as we've talked about this?
Well, I've covered the 3 stages of before, during, and after, and I hope that there is at least one actionable thing in each of those stages. But I just really want to take a moment to zoom out to provide a bigger picture that by conversing with consent and really integrating this throughout your entire process, not only are you setting yourself up to be a memorable podcast host where people are happy to refer you and share your podcast just because of how you treat people. Yes, you're also going to help guests get excited about sharing your episode too. But there's 2 other things I really want to emphasize. Number 1, you are significantly going to reduce the vulnerability hangovers that tend to happen when guests, again, they are asked questions that they're not actually comfortable answering, but they don't know how to navigate out of that. You're going to reduce that so much or completely eradicate it, right? And so there won't be that shame around sharing the episode because they are happy and they are proud of the things that they shared with you. So that's number 1. And number 2, big picture. How we treat people. We are being watched for that. We are being witnessed for how we treat people. And so when people actually see the respect, the intention that you're integrating through these conversations, this is actually an indicator of what it could be like to work with you in a completely different way, right? Because this context we're talking about is through a podcast interview, right? But it's still an intimate conversation. And if you are a service provider, if you are a coach, if you're a mentor, any type of space holder, how you treat people here in a free platform, in most cases for podcasts, that is going to paint you in a really positive light for them to consider working with you on an even deeper level. So I just want to kind of share that because I've hosted this workshop, Converse with Consent, before, and I've had people who I was really shocked who joined this workshop and they told me, do you know what? I was really afraid to admit how I've been kind of guessing my way through this, and I've been afraid to admit the mistakes I've made. And by actually being really mindful of how I hold space, this actually is creating that bigger ripple effect of how we treat people, the kind of community you want to call in. So yeah, just how you treat people one space is going to be an indication to how you treat people in other spaces, especially if they are in paid containers with you. So just a big picture there.
Yeah, and definitely worth saying. So I'm so glad you did. Mai-kee, this has been so good. And I know I definitely have my marching orders on things that I want to change in my workflow just to ensure, especially that front end, even though, yeah, we're talking about podcasting, we're talking about our journey, there might be something, right, that someone doesn't want to talk about. And I want to be able to hold space for that. So I really love that. And that's what I'm going to do after we're done with this. But if anyone is
tasks.
right, exactly. Where can people go to find you, get to know you, listen to your show, join your paid private podcast, all of that fun stuff?
Okay, there are several places. So I'm just going to start off with a podcast since, this is a podcast about podcasts. It's so meta in so many ways.
Yes.
So there are 2 places that you can find my podcast. So my free one is called the Quiet Rebels podcast. Those are the big picture conversations with business owners who dare to do things differently and just kind of take us along for the journey of how they're changing the status quo. So you can find that over at maikeetsang.com/podcast. And if you are interested in the paid one, right now it is $99 USD, but the price is going to go up at some point because of how deep the conversations are going to go in paid territories and things. So right now, at full transparency, is $99, and you can get that at maikeetsang.com/inside the invite. And so I'll be sure to pop links so that people don't need to try and spell my name because most people won't be able to spell it correctly if they just heard it because I get called Mai-kee all the time. No, incorrect. But those are my podcasts. But I would have to say that the best place to connect with me is actually by joining my email list. So you can go to, I think it's Mai-kee Tsang /Inside Insights. And that's very much kind of like behind the scenes. I take you along for the journey of how I unsubscribe from the urgency culture, sustainable visibility. And there are just some things there that I just never talk about in public. So kind of like on social media. But
right.
On social media, the best place to find me is on Instagram because I'm very much in my stories. I do have a static 9 grid, which means it looks like I'm not on there, but find me in my stories, find me in my DMs. It is me responding to you, and I can prove it with my voice and or a video. So there are, 4 places you can find me. Quiet Rebels, Inside the Invite, join my email list for the behind the scenes conversations, and also have an actual conversation with me on Instagram.
Yes, and we will make sure that we have links for all of that in the show notes as well as on the blog post. So if you're driving or listening to this on the go, we've got you covered. We'll make sure we have all those links for you. Mai-kee, thank you so much. This has been so incredible. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and all the best to your lovely listeners.